Hi everybody, in this video we're going to cover everything you need to know about constraints in SQL. What they allow us to do is they allow us to apply rules to a table which restrict the type of data which we input into it. So the very first constraint we're going to look at is the not null constraint. This constraint is used whenever you want to prohibit the value null being input into a column. So over here I'm creating a table, and the table is going to be called not null example. It's going to have two columns, and for the first one, which is going to have integer values, they cannot be null. And the second column is simply going to be filled with integer values. So let's go ahead and execute this code block. And after I refresh over here, you can see that under the table ribbon, we have the not null example table, and it has the two columns, the first and the second. Now, if we select everything from it, you'll see it is completely empty, but let's try and fill it with just any random values. So we're going to insert into the not null example table the values 5 and 6. Now you'll see that this will work without any problem whatsoever. So if I select the values again, you can see that 5 and 6 has been entered into the table. Now, how about I try and insert into the first column the value null? Now, as you would expect, this will not work. So if I execute this, you can see that this error message pops up at the bottom saying that the first column cannot be null over here in the error code. And that is exactly what the constraint has done. If, on the other hand, I try and put any number into the first column, such as a 1, and a null into the second column, this will work. So let me execute this. And you can see that in our table, we now have this second pair of values, 1 and null, because the not null constraint is only applied to the first column. So let's move on to the next constraint, which is going to be the unique constraint. So the unique constraint does what the name suggests. It makes sure that the values in a certain column remain unique. So there is not allowed to be any duplicate values. So let's go ahead and create a table where the first column has integer values and it has the restriction unique, and the second column simply has integer values. So if I go ahead and execute this, you can see that it's executed successfully. And if I refresh, you can see that now we have the second table, which is called unique example. If I select all the values inside, it's going to be an empty table. Of course it is, we've not added anything into it. But let's try and add some values. First off, let's try and add these two pairs of values. So 1, 1 and 2, 2. This is going to work without any problems because both of these values in the first column are going to be unique. Now, how about we try and add the values 1 and 3? You'll already see that the first column that we have over here is going to have another 1. Now that is why this is going to fail, because we already have the value 1 in our first column, but let me show you that it does. So if I execute it, you can see the small red X, and it says that in the error code, there's a duplicate entry 1 for the key unique example first column. And that is exactly why this value won't be input into the table and you won't see it in the table. Now, another thing that you should bear in mind is that null values are actually accepted. So if I go ahead and replace the 1 with a null, we can go ahead and execute this one time. And you can see that it runs successfully, but let's see what it's done to the table. So over here, you can see that this third value down here, which is the one that we just created, now has a null in the first column. All right, fair enough. Well, how about we try and execute this again? Let's maybe change the number at the very end to a 1. Which means that a 1 is going to be input into the second column and the null value is going to be input into the first again. And you can see that it executes again. So even though we have applied this unique constraint, it allows us to create multiple null values. So I can go ahead and execute this as often as I want. I've executed it a couple times now. And you can see we get all these null values inserted into the first column. So the unique constraint only applies to values outside of null. So if I try to add a 1 or a 2 into the first column, that won't let me do it. So let me try it with a 2. You can see that that's going to fail. You can see that by the red crosses down here, and it's saying duplicate entry 2, and these values won't be input into the table. You can see that there's only 1, 2 that remains and 1, 1. So bear in mind that if you have the unique constraint applied, it only applies to values outside of null. So you can have as many nulls as you want in the first column, but you can only have other values other than null only one single time. Okay, so up next is the primary key constraint. So let's take a closer look at the primary key and what it does. The interesting thing about the primary key is that it combines the not null and the unique condition. That means in contrast to what we had earlier, where we are able to input multiple nulls into a unique column, we cannot do that anymore for a primary key. In addition to that, the primary key is only allowed once within a table. So if we want to create a primary key, there's two ways of doing it. The very first one I've added up here. So we're going to create a table called primary key example. And if we want to apply the primary key to the ID, then we can write it right after the field over here. So ID, it's going to be an integer value, and then we can restrict it to be a primary key. The other way to do it is to simply create a table first and specify the table, the column name, and the data type. And at the very end, specify within parentheses what the primary key is going to be. So let me show you that both of these work. If I go ahead and execute this very first query, you can see it ran successfully. And you can also see that we have this primary key example table. And if I go to the columns down here under the columns ribbon and go to the very first column, you can see that it says that it is a primary key, the ID field. You can see it by this PK down here in the bottom left-hand corner. Slightly small, but you should be able to see it. But let's go ahead and drop this table for a moment. Let's drop the table and drop it now. And let me show you that you get exactly the same result if you execute the code down here. So I'm going to run it. I'm going to refresh, and you can see we have the primary key example table back again. And if I click on the ID, you can see that it is the primary key on the ID field. So both of these ways are legitimate ways of creating a primary key on a field. Now let's try and create a couple of values for this table. So I'm going to insert into the primary key table the two values that you see down here. And what you'll notice is that I have in the primary key field, in the ID field, the value 1 for both Peter Thiel and Peter Parker. So that is not going to work because the ID field is a primary key. It needs to be unique and not null. But let me go ahead and execute this. And now you can see that it says duplicate entry 1 for primary key. So this is not going to input anything. You can also see within the table that there's no new values. So let's go ahead and try this again. But now let's try and adjust the ID to 2. So now these IDs are different. That's why it's going to work. It ran successfully. And in the table, you can see that the values have been input without a problem. Now let me try and insert one more value, which is going to be this one right here. So you can see that I'm inputting as the ID the null value, then as the first name it's going to be the max value, and the last name is going to be gravy. So let's see what happens if I try and insert this. You can see that it gives me an error message because it says that the ID cannot be null. And that is also a result of the primary key condition. We cannot have null values within the primary key. All right, moving on, we're going to look at the foreign key next. So let's briefly talk about the foreign key. The foreign key prevents us from adding data into one column, which would break the relationship to another column in another table. I think it's easiest to explain this by looking at a very simple example. It will become really clear in a moment. So over here I have a members table and I have an orders table. And as you would expect, the members can place orders for some goods. So let's look at the members table in a bit more detail. We have the member ID, we have the first name and the last name of a member. Let's go ahead and create this table by running the code. And you can see that it should pop up under the table ribbon as it does. And we have this orders table, which has an order ID, the name of what was ordered, and the member ID of the member from the members table that ordered the specific product. If we want to declare a column as being the foreign key, we can simply write foreign key, and in this case we want the member ID of the orders table to be our foreign key because it references the member ID within the members table. You can see over here in the members table we have the member ID, and this is exactly what we're referencing over here. So let's go ahead and also create the second orders table, and as you can see under the tables ribbon I have the members and the orders. And at the moment both of these tables are still empty. So let me go ahead and fill the members table with a couple of values. I'm going to be adding these two value pairs into the members table. I'm going to be adding Peter Thiel, who has a member ID of 1, and Peter Parker, who has a member ID 2. So that's not going to be an issue. Let me run it and then select everything from the members table. And you can see that I have the two members, Peter Thiel and Peter Parker, in the members table. Now let me try and add something into the orders table. And this is where it becomes a bit more interesting. So I'm going to be adding the order ID 1, and it is going to be a shampoo ordered by the member who has the ID of 1. Let's remind ourselves what member had the ID of 1. So in this case, it was Peter Thiel. And so now if I go ahead and run this, there's not going to be any issue because we have added over here a member ID, which is also present in the members table. But let's see what happens if I try and add an ID of a member that doesn't exist. So you can see that in the members table, I have the member IDs 1 and 2. So if I try and put any other value, such as 3 over here, into the orders table, so let me just increment the order ID to 2. Let me maybe change the object from shampoo to whatever else you can buy, for example, bread. And let me try and put this value into the orders table. You can see that that won't work. You can already see the error message down here. And if we look at the error code, it says cannot add or update a child row because a foreign key constraint fails. And the reason why it's not allowing us to add this value that I just put over here is because we don't have a member ID of 3 in the members table. So that's why we can't add the member ID 3 into the orders table, because it's our foreign key. It has to also be present in the member ID column. So as you can see, if I go to the orders, the bread will not have been added. I can execute as much as I want, nothing will happen. If, however, I then go to the member ID 2, then this will be inserted without any issues because, of course, we have in the members table a member with the ID of 2, which is Peter Parker, and that is also why the order has been created with a member ID 2. All right, that's it for the foreign key. Let's move on to default values. So default values are perhaps the easiest thing to cover on our list of constraints because they quite simply fill a field with a default value. So over here I've created a small table. It's going to have an ID, a first name, a last name, and a country. And let's say that most of our customers are from Germany, and that's why we're going to give the country the default value Germany. So right now, if I go ahead and create this table, let me make sure that it's created over here. So it's going to be called the default example table right here. And at the moment, it's still going to be empty, but let me insert a very first value into the table. So let me go ahead and insert Peter Thiel, who has the ID of 1, into this table. And you'll see that if I go ahead and select all the values, even though I only added these 3 values, it has filled the country value automatically. So I have the ID 1, the Peter as the first name, the last name Thiel, and then as the country, it automatically added Germany. So another way to make sure that the default value is taken is that I can go ahead and also add the country over here and then simply write default as the value which I'm inputting. So of course, when you're inserting into a table, the individual columns are mapped to the values, or other way around. The values are mapped to the columns. So 1 is put into the ID, Peter is put into the first name, Thiel is put into the last name, and into the country, we are putting the default value, which we've specified as Germany. So if we go ahead and run this, you can see that in our table, we don't get anything yet. Oh, that's because I've already added Peter Thiel. So let me go ahead and maybe switch that up to 2 and make this Peter Griffin. And now it should work. So let me go ahead and run this again. And you can see that we have now successfully added Peter Griffin, and the country that he's assigned to is also Germany because we've passed in the default value, which is Germany, as one of the values. Now, of course, if you don't want one of the individuals that you're adding to the table to be assigned to Germany, you can simply override the value. So one way to do that is to simply add a new value, which is going to be the third one. He's going to be Peter Parker. And for the country, you want to add France. So let's go ahead and insert this value into the table. And you can see that when I select everything from the default example table, we have the third value, which is Peter Parker, but his country is now France. And that is quite simply because we have overwritten the default value, which was Germany. So that's it for the default. Let's move on to the check constraint. So the check constraint makes sure that we can only add values to the table that pass this check. So let's have a look at this sample table over here. It's going to be the table called check example. It's going to have an ID, a first name, a last name, and an age. And let's say that we only want to add individuals to the table who have an age which is greater than or equal to 21 years. So if we go ahead and create this table, and then we go into the insert into a query over here and add the following values down here. So we're adding the ID of 1, the first name Max, the last name Foster, and an age of 23. You can see that this will work without a problem. So if I go back to the table, you can see that this entry, Max Foster, with the age of 23 was input without any issues. Now let's maybe change the age to 18, and let's change the ID to 2, and let's call this individual Maya, and we'll call her Bell as a last name. Now this entry won't be passing our check because the age over here is not greater than 21. That's why whenever we try and insert this, you can see that we get this error and it says that the check constraint is violated. And that is because the age is lower than 21. And that's why this value is not going to be inserted. And you can also see this in the table. It has not been inserted after I executed the insert into statement over here. That is exactly what the check statement does. Now we're moving on to the last constraint, which is the auto increment. Auto increment is the last constraint I want to cover in this video. So auto increment, as the name suggests, increments the value within a certain column. So over here, I've created another table, and it is called the auto increment example table. And we have the ID column, the first name and the last name. And if we look at the ID column, we have it set to a primary key. It is an integer value. And we have an auto increment over here. So the value in the ID column, every time we insert a new value, will be incremented. I can show you that that works by, let's say, taking 3 values and adding them into the table. So over here, you can see that I'm inserting into the auto increment example table the 3 values that you can see down here. That's the second and that's the third. And within the ID field, I've always added a null because that is going to be filled by the auto increment giving it values. So let me just quickly execute that. Oh, hold on. Let me create the table first, and then let me execute that. And if we look into the table now, you can see that the values which we've inserted aren't null, but they have created values that automatically increment over here. Now, I do want to stress that the auto increment will keep incrementing, so even if you delete all the values that we have just created, even if we go ahead and delete them from the table, so now you can see that there aren't any values in the table anymore. If we go ahead and insert the same values we added before, then you can see that it has incremented the values again, but now starting from 4. Because earlier, the first 3 values that we had went to the ID 3, and since we're always incrementing the ID, we're moving on to 4, 5, and 6. So if I go ahead and execute this once again, you can see that we have the values 7, 8, and 9 within this table. And if I go ahead and delete everything again and add some values again, you'll see that the auto increment keeps incrementing the values regardless of whether or not there are any other values within the table, and it does not reset to 1 whenever we delete values. So that is it for auto increment. I hope that you enjoyed this video and it helped you out. If it did, then make sure to leave a like on this video, subscribe to this channel if you are new, and we will see each other in the next video.